Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Agroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. And today on the show, we're going to take a look at another email from a listener. So very excited to get into that. As usual, I haven't read the email yet, but I did see the subject line, so I have an idea of the topic. But don't worry, I haven't prepared anything else because I like to do it a little bit more off the cuff. It's a little bit more fun that way, but it can lead to lots of mistakes, as you all know. So we'll do our best. But all right, let's bring up this email now. So this email comes to us from, if I have it right here. Yes, okay. So this comes from Michaela, and the subject line is Help with Traveling Montages and Epic Fantasy. And so here we go. Hey, John and Natalia as well. Big fan of the show. Your episodes have helped me level up my writing in so many ways. That's awesome. I've got a specific struggle right now I'd love your insight on. I'm working on an epic fantasy novel inspired by East Asian cultures. Lots of historical influence, spiritual systems, and political intrigue. It's a journey story, and the characters travel a lot, across mountains, through misty bamboo forests, border towns, and sacred sites. I'm really struggling with how to write the traveling parts. I don't want to skip over them completely since the setting is such a huge part of the story, but I also don't want the book to turn into a nature blog with swords. That's funny. I've tried inserting character moments, lore drops, and a few mini encounters, but I still worry the pacing drags. How do I write traveling scenes that feel immersive, emotionally rich, and still keep the story moving? Any advice or examples from other writers you think handle this well would be amazing. Thanks again for all the great content. This show has seriously kept me going. Best, Michaela. All right. Wow. That is a super fun email. And that definitely has me thinking about how I've run into this plenty of times, because one of the things that gets in your way when you're trying to do these like traveling montages, you're trying to cover a large geography, but in a way that fits a word count that makes sense for you, that's accessible, where you don't feel like the book's getting too bloated. So I totally understand that instinct. And traveling scenes also have gotten in my way in terms of drafting, because I get bored sometimes writing my own stuff where I feel like, okay, but the plot isn't moving, right? We're going from town to town. Maybe we're collecting friends. And I think part of the reason this impacted me is because when I was first kind of getting into fantasy writing, my two main influences, this was when I was like in my early 20s. My two main influences were Song of Ice and Fire, because I had just, poured myself into those books. And also I was and am and has almost always been a huge fan of One Piece, right? The format of One Piece, if you've never seen it, is that the characters kind of go from island to island, and you get like a new friend, like a new crew member, and there's always this kind of like contained situation, and it's a long running story. It's been going on since 1998. So that can be detrimental sometimes, because that influenced me in a way where I felt these epic, grand ambitions, right? Now, I think whether you're doing a fantasy that is inspired by East Asian culture, like this writer is saying, or if you're doing something that's, kind of Western, if you're doing something like in my space, I like to do a lot of Caribbean Taino mythology. Last year, I finished up a book that was, pirates and very, very fantasy heavy. And I learned a lot actually during that time in terms of, okay, I had this ambition that I wanted to cover this big stretch of land. I wanted to be able to go to these different places. And one of the things that really pushed me along in that journey was the feeling like, okay, how do I do this in a way that doesn't make me feel bored? Well, I tried to make sure that almost every chapter, at least in the first 2/3 of the book, every new chapter took us to a completely new place. And it was always going to be completely different. So in like one chapter, you kind of have these like, it's kind of groggy. You have these warrens. We're going kind of underground. It's seedy. And I always try to add in these layers so you feel like you're discovering these locations. And this was very key too. As these characters are going through these locations, because they're different, I tried to really hone in on how we could reveal things about characters through the settings they're in. It's a very neat trick. It works all the time. You contrast the setting with the character. In what way does the character fit into the place that you have orchestrated, right? And in what ways do they not fit in, where they feel like, they're out of place, and that creates anxiety. And then you can like layer emotions into it. And so I didn't have to do a lot of traveling montages, because at that point I was able to just sort of make each of these mini locations along this larger journey feel like destinations unto themselves. And that's actually what I think, that's kind of what makes One Piece work. It doesn't feel like these places are pit stops. It feels like they're all instrumental building blocks to a larger narrative. So you would have, again, you would have that kind of location. And then the next chapter would be completely different. I would be very intentional about, okay, I want the characters to be on this ship. And this isn't like the other ships. This isn't a pirate ship. This is a steam ship. So completely different situation, kind of location. And then maybe the chapter after that, we're kind of going along this river between these two coasts, and it's like a bog or something. Or then I'd be like, all right, now we're on a ship that's more kind of like a prison ship. So essentially, it feels like, because these locations are changing all the time, you feel that sprawling land that I think Michaela is trying to get across in their book, right? They're trying to get across, like, this is a cool setting, it's part of the story. And making it part of the story means making sure all these locations stand out. And I think one of the other things too, that's, I don't want to say it's underrated, but I would say that not only should the setting reveal a lot about the character, it should also reveal change in the character. It should feel like these places have an effect that resonates throughout the story, whether it's a dusty road and that feeling of endless horizon. What does that do to the character? Does it kind of change their emotional state? That's something that you can do all the time, right? Where you can treat the journey less like dead space, and you can, make it so that even just walking down a road, like the road starts shifting, right? You add in all these complications that make it feel like wherever we're going to go, the characters are going to be in these tense, who knows what's going to happen sort of moments. And that's really important for sure. A good example of this would probably be The Grace of Kings does this pretty well. I think Wheel of Time does this differently than a lot of books, because part of the point of Wheel of Time is that a lot of the traveling is boring, but that's part of the story. It's sort of like these kids who grew up in this like haven, this kind of like remote, nobody bothers them. It's called the Two Rivers, Emmons Field. And, their lives are pretty normal. They're like sheep herders and stuff. But then they have to go on this journey, and it's sort of like an evolution of the Tolkien style of traveling, where they don't have bread that fills them up, for days or weeks. No, it's brutal. It's way more brutal. It's a tougher journey because they have to like work for their food. They have to learn these skills. They have to do the same things over and over again. And that's part of the story. It's part of what makes it compelling, because you're making that relevant about the characters. You're seeing the character change. How does the main character sort of come of age and grow into a man? A lot of that is in the first and second book, where he's on his own for the first time, and he's facing the reality of being out on his own. It's never undercut. It's never given short shrift. You feel him just anguishing of like, I'm starving. I'm sleeping under the rain. This sucks. It's so difficult. But we learn so much about Rand. We see Rand kind of come into his own, right? And so then it makes the culmination in later books where he starts to be that mature person who can have these more, this ability to be able to move through the world with more confidence, all the more earned, right? And it's funny too, because somebody commented on one of the YouTube videos and said that, yeah, I tried Wheel of Time and I don't like it. And I was like, look, Wheel of Time is not for everybody, right? Lord of the Rings is not for everybody. So I never want to give these recommendations in the sense that you have to, use them as reference points of like, well, you're not really a fantasy writer unless no, don't worry about any of that stuff. But anyway, I would say my key piece of advice there is, if you show the same place twice, if you do decide to do that, show them going in and them going out. Mines of Moria would be a good example of this from Lord of the Rings, because then you see how the characters are when they're going into the place, and then you check in with them leaving the place. This is something I don't always do, because I try to have a little bit tighter pacing on this, but it's a good thing to try at least a couple of times in your novel if you can. So you can really, send the message to the reader that these places are having an effect. I think too, one of the things I run into when I read travel montages, and I don't love travel montages, I try to use them more as like diary entries, and it's more about like, okay, we're on this ship and here's what happened over the week. And I try to add other things to it of like, there's comedy maybe, or there's tight character moments and it's broken up. But I think part of the reason I struggle with just doing it more straightforward is because the traveling should also reveal how the world works. Sometimes I read these traveling montages and it just feels like a lot of description, and it doesn't feel like the description is really saying anything. This is something I ran into a lot when I suspect something is written by AI, because I think AI writing does this a lot, where it's like, it's a lot of description, but it's not saying anything. It's kind of just empty. It's sort of like, it looks like this and it does this. And then you're like, okay, so what? you know, Instead, part of it is because I think, when it's genuinely a writer, a human writer just trying to describe, right? It's because maybe they want you to picture it, right, in your head a little bit better. And that's great. I want to be able to picture and feel immersed. But okay, if you're going to describe, the way that the window has this like, specific sheen to it or whatever, make it, use a metaphor, use some kind of symbolism, be like, it's frozen over like funeral days. That's a line that I used in a recent short story of mine. And the reason I went with that kind of description is because I'm describing the place, I'm making it clear. But one of the themes of the story is how cold people are. And the idea of likening a frozen over, like a frost window, to funeral days, it shows you the image in your head, but it also sends that motif of like death, that the cold is punishing here, that the characters can die any second from the chill. And in fact, the story literally starts with a character dying. So there you go. But yeah, it's a way to describe in a way that just truly goes beyond basic description. One thing I think of is She Who Became the Sun is pretty good about this. Like, I feel like the travel scenes in that have a lot of like spiritual and political contrast. It's not my favorite book. I think there are a lot of flaws to it, but I thought it was a good read. I enjoyed it enough. But it didn't feel like a lot of that stuff was exposition, or it was just like filler, or was lore for the sake of it. It did feel like it always had a point to it, right? And Song of Ice and Fire is usually pretty good about that too. Although, Martin is pretty well known for having tons of description that's just like, we don't need to know how much food is at the table. Like, we're good, But at least he does it really well with good prose. So you at least get to enjoy good prose when that gets a little, monotonous. And speaking of monotony, I think, the mini encounters was brought up in the email, and I like to think of them as, instead of mini encounters, think of them as micro conflicts. That might help you out more, because a micro conflict can be something that feels low stakes at first, but it balloons, right? Khal Drogo in Game of Thrones, it starts with just like a stab right to the chest, and it turns into this huge thing that ends up becoming, the undoing of a lot of things, right? And you can do all kinds of things with that. Like, somebody breaks their ankle, or a storm kind of messes up your travel plans. They go to a village and, nobody's willing to give them shelter because of maybe their reputation. These little conflicts can really, like, they're tiny moments, right? But they can just add more and more to that harsh reality of being out in these places. And you can build upon the inner conflicts as well, how the characters react to this. One character wants to push on, another character doesn't. And you create the strife, you create room for the character arcs to mesh and merge and do all these creative things. And in these cases, you're letting things like nature and landscape and personality and characterization drive the story. And that's such a powerful way to really keep your story moving, where it feels like it's moving. It doesn't feel like I'm just reading and reading and reading. They go to this town, they have to deal with this problem. Okay, we solved the problem. Now we're moving on. You need to kind of have a little bit more of like a yes and yes, but that's kind of a Brandon Sanderson thing. But yeah, I think that micro conflicts are the way to go, 100%. And lastly, I'll say that, let's say you're like, okay, John, I'm in. We're gonna use these traveling montages to kind of reflect the inner state of the character. Sure. I think too, you can use the environment to your advantage as a writer to either echo or contradict emotion, right? So I already kind of talked about how you can evoke themes and motifs like death, right? But you could also contrastly do it to reflect emotion, how characters are feeling, right? And on something like that, if you go through like a valley, the valley can just make a character's grief all the sharper, right? Where they feel like they're in this place and there's no way out, right? You use the environment to kind of reflect like how that character is feeling. Or, like an endless desert can make a character feel like they are in a crisis, because they feel like no matter what direction they take, whatever moral decision they make, they're still going to be trapped in this place that is going to just consume them, right? Avatar: The Last Airbender, I immediately thought of, the desert in that, but like also Zuko alone, one of the best episodes, is just such a perfect kind of micro story that really captures Zuko's inner turmoil, because he is in a location with all of this strife, people who don't have a lot, but it's because of him. He's the prince of a nation that has exploited and wreaked havoc on these people. And now these people are being victimized by their own side, a side that he kind of clashes against. And in that episode, Zuko ends up trying to like liberate, right? In a kind of Western way. He tries to liberate these townspeople. When they figure out who he really is, it all kind of comes crashing down because his environment is contradicting his emotion. The environment of, I can be the hero. I can come into this Western town, kind of come in and be the cool guy and do whatever. But when it comes down to it, and he has to own up to who he really is, the guilt comes in too. And that is, it's masterful because you have multiple emotions kind of playing with the environment. And that's what makes it such a compelling watch, and what makes it clearly such a reflection of how a lot of these writers too, especially in the Avatar series and Legend of Korra, how they were able to always, because we talked about East Asian mythology and stuff like that, they were always able to use these like specific reference points of East Asian, Southeast Asian, Inuits, all that stuff, right? They were able to use those things to not just build the world, but they were able to use it as a way to just create world conflicts that resonated and rang true. Something that I think in the wake of Avatar: The Last Airbender's success, the original series ended in 2008, and we saw kind of a YA boom when the people who grew up on Avatar: The Last Airbender, they kind of came into their own. They came into their 20s and 30s. They started writing books, and we started seeing a lot of books kind of mimicking that structure. And there are definitely some good ones, but I think a lot of them struggled with this because they had the right points. They had the right kind of like, yeah, we're gonna take these existing things and we're gonna add our own twists to them. But they were sort of missing some of this artistry that I'm kind of referencing here, where you're taking something as simple as traveling from place to place and being able to do it efficiently in a way that's entertaining, but not treating it as like, I have to figure this out because, I want to get to the meaty parts of the story. Listen, your travel montages, they can be your story. They can be where your story lives and breathes. So that would be my advice, is that you don't necessarily have to worry about a travel montage being in your way, right? It is a road to the end of the book for a reason, and it can do so much work. So thanks again to Michaela for writing in. That was a really fun one. And as always, be sure to subscribe to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. You can email us anytime if you have your own question about fantasy writing you want us to talk about. fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com is how you get in touch. We also have a Discord. It's linked up in the show notes, but that's where you can also hang out with some of our writing community folks and the larger world of In Between Drafts. But with that, if you'd like to read any of my original fiction, I have 5 anthologies coming out this year. I will have stories that are going to be appearing in multiple anthologies. So a couple speculative, there's a kind of a sci-fi, there's 2 sci-fi ones, and I'll be regularly posting about that and revealing about that. But you can read a lot of my original stuff for free on my Substack, which is called Cetera, and you can find that in the show notes as well, cetera.substack.com. I release a new story every Thursday. So this latest story is a fun one too, especially if you're kind of curious what my writing process is. I reveal a little bit more of how I write than I usually do. How I take things that happen to me in real life, and the way I take notes and the way that I translate them into a story. You can check that out. That story is called Frequency, which just came out, so you can find that. And it's in the author's note where I kind of talk about, hey, here's how I kind of did this. So maybe I'll do a larger episode about that. Or if you haven't seen it yet, I did do a kind of analysis on one of my stories called Songs for the Dead and Drowning, a very, very fun fantasy one. A more recent fantasy story I wrote that you can check out if you want another reference point is a fairy tale retelling of The Little Match Girl. So that one's called The Little Match Girl Makes Good. So you can check that out too. And that's where the funeral days window thing came from. But anyway, that's enough out of me. Thanks, as always, for watching or listening. If you are checking out the podcast, with that, I'll see you on the next one. Be sure to keep writing if that's what you feel like doing.